Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox, the director. This has been a momentous week in American politics. The Republican National Convention is meeting in Milwaukee in the shadow of the shocking events, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, now captured in that picture that seems to have gone everywhere. Trump, bloodied but defiantly raising a fist, mouthing the words, "Fight." He has already been formally confirmed as the party's nominee for president, and now we know that he has picked the junior Republican senator from Ohio, JD Vance, as his running mate. So these events leave us with many questions. What does it say about the dangers of polarization in American politics? What is the future of the country as it enters this uncertain election? And is there any doubt now that Donald Trump is the clear favorite to win? And what is it going to mean? We're also going to talk a bit about President Joe Biden. It's been 3 weeks since his disastrous debate. Performance really upended his campaign, and we'll talk about where that is going to go now. I have a really brilliant panel to discuss all this. Joining me down the line from the RNC in Milwaukee is Edward Luce, the U.S. national editor and columnist at the Financial Times. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks, Bronwen.
Great to have you with us. And joining us from the Aspen Security Forum is David Sanger, the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times and the author of New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Save the West.
Great to be with you.
Really, really great to have you here. And with me in the studio here is Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, the head of our US and Americas program. Welcome back.
Thank you, Bronwen.
Let's talk first about the response to the shooting and what it means for Donald Trump. Edward, there's been extraordinary scenes at this convention, and he's picked someone who really doubles down on his own views and approach.
He has. I mean, JD Vance is sort of a doubling of the bets on MAGA, on America First. He's kind of the mini-me, the Trump mini-me. He's the opposite of broadening the appeal of the party that, say, a Nikki Haley would have represented, as in reaching out to women who are worried about abortion being made illegal, etc. JD Vance is like a hard-boiled MAGA figure, believes in a national abortion ban, but also, I think, more importantly, for an international audience, is very much on the America First page with core Trumpian instincts, distrust of NATO, dislike of NATO, I think, complete indifference to the fate of Ukraine. China, like Trump, he's probably a bit more of an unknown quantity. But for the so-called new realists on the new right, those who believe that Europe really should be left to its own devices, Vance's selection is, an absolute triumph. This is a vindication for the anti-Reaganite wing of the Republican Party.
David, do you share that view that the old guard of the Republicans have really been chased off to the wings, if not further?
Oh, absolutely. The interventionist, the United States stands for the spread of democracy around the world view, which sort of had its high point in the second inaugural address of George W. Bush, who said it would be the mission of the United States for the next 70 or 80 years to go make sure that the spread of democracy went unimpeded and to fight back against authoritarians. That's all missing from the platform. When you look at the platform, what you see is a lot of capital letters that tell you who actually wrote this. And you see very little of the Reagan/George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush approach to the world. But more importantly, for Vance himself, I think what you have seen is he picked the one option for a member of the Senate who has been the most vocal in opposing U.S. continued aid for Ukraine, who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said, let us cut it all off because there's just no way to provide them with enough air defense, with enough artillery, and any way we need it for Taiwan. So if you're Vladimir Zelensky, or if you are any of the European leaders who have just come back from the NATO summit, imbibing the line that Putin would not stop at Ukraine, you've got to begin to think about the fact that you have 3 or 4 months to radically revise your defense strategy.
Leslie, what does America First mean?
Well, it seems to mean different things to different people underneath that umbrella. I mean, a couple of things on JD Vance. First of all, on who he plays to. I mean, I agree very much with what Ed and David have said. He's doubling down on the MAGA agenda, the demographic. He's
Just for those
speaking
listening
to
around the world, that is, make America great again.
speaking to that white working class male. But there is, a little bit more to him, which is, as we know, he has an Indian wife. She's highly educated. She's a lawyer. And so when I've already seen some murmurings in the MAGA wing of the Republican Party saying, why did he choose this man with with an Indian wife? How does that speak to our base? So we know JD Vance has changed his positions. He used to be anti-Trump. Now he's pro-Trump. Maybe he used to, have different social priorities, but he chose a woman in his life. And that's a very big sign that he's not exactly how he's portraying himself.
And his book, Hillbilly Elegy, that brought him to fame in the beginning, was one that was praised by many liberal writers.
Absolutely. So there's, and there is a question right now. He is the vice presidential candidate. Maybe he becomes vice president. He would be on a ticket with an older president who's clearly subject to, unfortunately, an assassination attempt, probably more violent attacks. He could well become the next candidate to be president. And perhaps then he changes. So there's sort of a question of that. A younger person is sending a very big signal when age has been such a highlight, and not in a good way, for this campaign. But the thing that stood out to me about him on the American First agenda, when he spoke to the Munich Security Conference before he was made the vice presidential candidate, he framed international politics as being about a problem of scarcity for the United States. And this really puts him in direct contrast with President Biden, who has said many times, we're a superpower. Of course we can do both these wars and do China. And, Vance's view is very clearly one that America has to set priorities. It has less ability to play in all theaters at the same time, and that it's not in America's vital interests to be supporting Ukraine, certainly not when Europe isn't stepping up on the question of manufacturing, producing ammunitions, cooperating, all the rest of it. So it's a position that we might not agree with it. We might think that actually America's security is caught up in Europe and in Ukraine. But it is a position that has a lot of resonance across the United States.
Edward, what has this done to Trump's support?
I think it's a very popular choice here on the floor of the convention. I mean, Vance is, kind of a folk hero to a lot of people, to a lot of genuine Trumpians. I mean, the fact that he, had this dramatic road to Damascus on Trump and went from describing him as a potential American Hitler in 2016 to the Caesar we need since 2022. That massive U-turn is sort of baked in. It's old news. It doesn't really sort of give anybody pause.
As he said, Trump convinced me.
Yes, he's changed his mind. And people accept that. And so that's not really a factor amongst Republicans at any rate. But I think he's a hugely popular choice. I mean, it was very interesting being there in the arena last night, watching, as in Tuesday night, watching Nikki Haley give her endorsement of Trump, which went down relatively well. But when she started talking about the need to reach out to undecided voters, people who aren't necessarily Trumpians, people like her who don't agree with Trump all the time, to broaden the coalition and have a unity, the hall just went silent. Nobody was interested in that.
No one was on for that.
No. And that's not Vance's approach. Vance's approach is full culture war. He talks about de-Baathification of the federal state. He talks about it as a regime. He talks about, the virus of wokeness. He's got the lines that really get the pulses racing. And I'll be fascinated to watch him, in his nomination speech and see what the response will be. I suspect it will be very rousing. He's a very, very far from being stupid or inarticulate. He's a very, very smart person.
He's got better lines than Trump in many ways.
Yes. And, he's 39. He is the future of Trumpism. I mean, of course, Leslie's right. He might well, if he did inherit the mantle, And it's my view, that Vance has got a greater chance of becoming president than Biden has of being reelected in November. But if he did inherit the mantle, as Leslie said, he might then, have another change of mind. But I doubt it. I think he's given a lot of thought in the last 3 or 4 years to why he's a Trumpian. And he is the sort of closest thing, I think, to a public intellectual defender of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, at the Republican National Convention, you go deep, right? Who actually turns up? It's the base. It's those who are most sort of stoked by the MAGA agenda. The language, right? And this has always been the question for Trump. If he wants to win in a general, even against a candidate, a president who is not polling well, he does have to, reach out to a broader swath of Americans. They're playing sort of two-prong on the economic agenda.
Two-prong? What do you mean?
Well, we will do tax cuts, but we will look after, working class Americans. It's not entirely clear exactly where they come down on. I think we all believe they'll come down on tax cuts and deregulation. And clearly that's the bet that many wealthy Americans are making. But there will have to be, an expansion of that rhetoric in order to get people to come on board the agenda. You can't win with, just the MAGA base. You got to expand beyond that. And I guess one play is it's the anti-immigration card that you can, now that there are more Blacks, more Hispanics in the party, still a little lower rate, but there are more there that might also like the anti-immigration rhetoric, then maybe you can sort of keep the conversation focused on MAGA, anti-immigration. But at some point, to have a sustainable presidency, to be elected and reelected, I just find it very difficult to believe that this is a winning strategy beyond, a convention.
Yeah, I think I would take some issue with that because I agree he's got to go expand the base. Just picking somebody who is literally half of Trump's age moves in that direction. Picking a white male who appeals to the base is important. But remember that a lot of the voters that they are fighting for here now are basically of Vance's generation who are trying to decide in the privacy of the voter booth whether they are more comfortable with Harris or more comfortable with Vance, because either one of them would have an unusually high chance, as Ed suggested, of becoming president. And we are now seeing an election that is being fought first for the traditional swing states. And, we all know where those are. It's Michigan and it's Wisconsin and it's Minnesota and Pennsylvania. But now, all of a sudden, Virginia is in play within sort of 2 points. And of course, Pennsylvania is quite close. And I think those are two states where Vance probably helps Trump the most. And if he wins either one of those, it's game over in this election. And there are some numbers we are seeing suggesting if Trump's lucky streak, and he certainly has had one in the past 2 or 3 weeks from the debate forward to the failed assassination attempt to the court rulings and so forth, everything has broken his way. If those continue, it could be a blowout election.
I've seen certainly numbers suggesting at the moment he may be ahead in all of the swing states. Edward, what do you think? Let's bring Biden into the picture.
I think we're on course. If the election were held today, I think Trump would win. But I think we're on course for somewhere between a clear win and a blowout win, unless something changes. And that immovable object is Biden, and the irresistible force, although right now it feels very resistible. Democrats getting more and more worried that precisely that is going to happen. So we've got 3-4 weeks before the Democratic convention. After that, it becomes impossible to remove Biden. It's actually impossible now to remove him. It's up to him. But I think a sign that he's really panicked about this deep, mostly publicly unexpressed skepticism amongst his Democratic colleagues is that he's rushing to get his nomination confirmed virtually in the next week, rather than wait, as you normally do, to the convention, which is late August. So this smacks of panic and is very much a tell that the Biden campaign is very, very aware that we're all having the same conversation. Chuck Schumer, in the Democratic Senate is having the same conversation. Nancy Pelosi is having this conversation. Some of them get leaked out. Adam Schiff, the candidate for California Senate seat, has said, I don't think we can win with Biden. And I think the down ballot races, we'll lose the Senate. We certainly won't regain the House. These leaks are going to get more and more profuse, and the pressure, the irresistibility of this force to remove Biden will get more irresistible, as it were. But right now, I see no signs of him budging. I see no signs. They're really digging in their heels.
I would agree with that completely. I was with some members of Congress yesterday who have gotten the wrath of Joe Biden, which, in private, for their pushing him to get out. He basically says, I'm the one who's got all of the votes within the nomination committee. I would be going against the overwhelming will of the voters. Now, the voters voted before that debate performance.
Before they saw how stumbling he was.
That's right.
On right through that shocking debate.
It certainly feels like in Europe has decided just in the last few days, the whole momentum here seems to have changed, and everybody wants to know everything that they need to know, can possibly know about JD Vance, about Donald Trump, that's sort of doubling down. I mean, these are intangibles, but you can feel it in the air that people in the United Kingdom and Europe have decided that they are now faced with inevitably and certainly a Trump presidency, which of course might not be what we see. Politics changes sometimes rapidly for reasons that we can't anticipate.
We're talking about the next few weeks, but that's exactly right. And Leslie, so let's use that as a pivot to talk just a bit about what a Trump presidency might look like and how countries are beginning to take that into their calculations.
Well, I think, as we all know, for Europe, for the UK, it's the number one focus and concern has been on what a Trump administration would do when it comes to Ukraine, whether they would pivot very quickly to trying to negotiate a deal, what that would look like, what that would mean. I think there is some more nuanced conversation taking place that actually maybe Trump wouldn't pull out of NATO, but might redirect some of the resources, or America would have a different role in NATO. But I think, people talk about a number of policies, but at the end of the day, I think or at the start of the day, I think the thing that many people are concerned about is, what would the style of engagement be? How certain would that diplomacy be? How bombastic would it be? And what ripple effects would that have through, the sort of working level arrangements? For the first 2 years of Trump's first administration, we used to hear here at Chatham House all the time, people will come in and they say, we know the tweets are bad, we know the headline is bad, but we're working together very well. The US and the UK are in a very, very strong position when it comes to working level arrangements on the most important and pressing security and economic matters. And that actually changed a lot when Trump pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and when he started to use tariffs against Europe. And now I think people are less confident that that working level relationship will remain intact, partly because we've all heard so much about Project 2025 and that a big motor behind...
Just for people who haven't, in 2 words.
The Heritage Foundation convened plan that is sort of a transitional plan for what a new administration would look like. And one of the things at the heart of it is, the replacement of a lot of civil servants, putting them on a Schedule F so that they're in effect serving at the will of the president, which could disrupt a lot of those deep, ongoing relationships.
So, Ed, do you think it's as cut and dried as that? I don't mean the election, but I mean the Trump-Vance positions on Ukraine, that if you were President Zelensky, you ought to be thinking now about how much you can get from Europe and indeed whether you're going to be forced into some kind of deal?
Vance will be vice president, and vice presidents, even with normal presidents, have no power except as to what's granted to them. And with Trump, Trump doesn't share power. So I think the significance of Vance right now is just that it expresses what Trump is feeling, the signal he wants to send. I have no doubt that on Ukraine, Trump is authentic and consistent. There are some issues, like particularly Taiwan, where I don't really know where he stands. And I think he's quite transactional. You saw he changed his view on TikTok. TikTok should be banned to no, TikTok shouldn't be banned because of a changing financial interest. So on China, I don't feel particularly confident predicting what a Trump administration would mean. But on Ukraine, I feel very confident. And I think from what I understand, and David will know this better, Vladimir Zelensky feels pretty confident too. It would be extremely bad news for Zelensky's ability to continue to prosecute this war. And when Trump says day one, well, maybe that's an exaggeration, that he would fix a deal with Putin to end the war on day one. But day 7, day 14, it would be pretty quick. And Trump means it. He keeps repeating it. He means what he says. He is not friendly to NATO.
And nor is he friendly to Ukraine. I mean, I go back to the interviews that Matt Gaben and I did with him on foreign policy in 2016. It was all, telegraphed there. Look, I think the fundamental issue for the Ukrainians is thinking about whether they define their future completely around territory or whether they define it around the functional operations of the country. And I argued in New Cold Wars that they may want to think more like a Korea model. Imagine this for a moment, Bronwen. Supposing we had been able to go to the South Koreans in 1953 and say, yes, we're leaving in limbo a whole big part of the territory that both you and North Korea claim. But I promise 70 years from now, you're going to be the world's 11th largest economy or 10th. You are going to be producing chips. You'd have to stop. It's 1953 and explain what chips are. And that even the United States is not producing. Your people will be touring the world as the rich tourists, right? And you won't even be thinking about that piece of territory anymore, which is basically where South Korea is today. I think they would have taken that deal. I think Ukraine's got every possibility of having the same talent set that South Korea had. But we can't convince them at this point that may be more important than the territory.
And what about Taiwan? Vance saying, look, we need these arms for Taiwan. You think there's more of a chance of a confrontation there?
I do, but I think, it was really interesting what former President Trump said in the Business Week interview, where suddenly, as Ed points out, that transactional Trump kicks in and he says, they stole our entire semiconductor business. They didn't steal it. We brought it to them, right? We said, we'll design, you manufacture. And as a result, they should be paying a much higher price for our defense. And then he goes on to point out accurately that Taiwan's a lot closer to China than it is to the United States. And therefore, it's a lot easier operation for the Chinese to pull off. Well, that may not be the deepest insight we've had in foreign policy, but it is geographically correct. So you see him now even backing away from the Taiwan commitments.
Yes, but as you said, there's an irreducible transactional element in it all. I'm thinking of what's the debate in South Korea, which you mentioned this week, where they're saying, look, Trump keeps telling us we need to pay more for the American protection, and we're not so sure we can count on this after all. What about having our own nuclear weapon? And that simmering debate has become very live.
We just held a session with Victoria Coates, Heritage Foundation, and Fred Fleitz, and they on the Asia question, Fred said that he thought the effort to bring Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. closer together was good. That he imagined that would continue, that strategic ambiguity would continue to be the policy. Victoria made the point that we're months behind on things that Taiwan has already paid for when it comes to defense that has to be delivered. But I mean, the broader point here is that, those people around that would like to work for Donald Trump, were they to be asked, they differ. And this is a president who we don't know. There are certain things, yes, I think Ed's exactly right. Ukraine, we have a lot of clarity. But on other things, there is a sense in which he switches on a dime. There's a lot of emotion and impulse.
Let me ask you finally about one of the uncertain things, but one of the ones I'm most concerned about with a vision of Trump too, and that is the Middle East, where talks are still continuing about a deal on hostages for ceasefire and so on, and yet a real fear that if Trump comes in, perhaps he's going to side, if this Israeli government is still there, with a very hard line elements of that indeed might want Palestinians pushed out to Egypt or Jordan. Anyway, that he might land in the middle of this and make it, if that's possible, even worse, or at least incapable of resolution. Any thoughts on this?
I would refer to the debate when Trump was pushed on this question of did he support a two-state solution, and he really didn't want to go there. On Israel, he said that they needed to finish the job. And when pushed on the question of a state for the Palestinians, he said, I think we'll have to wait and see. So again, I think, his commitment, wanting to get a deal for sure, wanting, a Nobel Peace Prize probably.
I
And
hadn't thought of that.
well,
Maybe he has.
I suspect he has. And where could he get it? And will there be a possibility of doing that in the Middle East? I think he would certainly double down on that. But there's no sense in his actions or in his words that a state for the Palestinians is, at the forefront of his thinking.
I think for President Biden, there would be no greater thing in the end of his first term than if he could get the ceasefire and have the outlines of a deal together. I think he thinks this would have greater electoral salience than I suspect it probably would. Trump definitely views himself as wanting that Nobel Peace Prize. And in fact, you heard him talking about his Nobel nominations and so forth during his time in office. Anything that looks like a large prize, whether it is winning a golf tournament or winning a Nobel, ranks high in the Donald Trump world.
I mean, if there are any Iranians on that Nobel committee, I doubt he would get that prize, because the one thing we know about his view of the Middle East is Iran is in his crosshairs. The only other thing I'd say is that, he is able to get deals sometimes. The art of the deal is not a complete fiction with Trump, and the Abraham Accords were deals. We might not have liked all of them or the way they were done. The missing piece of the Abraham Accords is the Saudi normalization. I suspect Trump thinks, and might be right in thinking, that he would be better able to get a Saudi deal to join the Abraham Accords than Biden would.
And we do know the Saudis want that deal. Well, with that image of Trump as a potential Nobel nominee and of peace deals all around, we're going to have to stop right there. But a lot more of this to come on Chatham House, on the American election, on Trump, on Biden, and on the congressional races. Leslie and her team are covering all that. Big thank you to my guests, Edward Luce, David Sanger, Leslie Vinjamuri. Do follow them all on X. Their details are in the show notes. And a reminder that you can find all the episodes of Independent Thinking on all the major platforms. So do please like, follow, and subscribe. After another too busy week here and abroad, it's goodbye from me. See you next week.